It doesn't just give us a love triangle, it gave us more of a sudden death love pentagon. Hello y'all, welcome back to Case Can Probably Read. My name is allegedly Casey. It's time to do a wrap up of all the books that I read in February, and I'm going to do just that. I read 6 books this month. Weirdly enough, only 2 of them have recent publishing dates. The rest were published in 2011 and 2012. I didn't plan it that way. It's not very interesting for me to tell you that, but I'm going to mention it anyways. First 2 books I read in February were Enclave and Outpost, which are both part of the Razorland series by Ann Aguirre. These books were published in 2011 and 2012, so squarely in the middle of the YA dystopia boom that was occurring at that time. The stories begin in a post-apocalyptic New York City where a virus of some kind and possibly a war have driven people to move underground to live in the tunnels below the city. They form communities called enclaves, and people in these enclaves can have one of 3 jobs. There are builders who build things. There are breeders whose job it is to procreate and raise children. And then there are hunters who hunt and kill animals in the tunnels to feed their enclave. And also they protect the enclave from freaks, which are these zombie-like humans who seem to have lower intelligence. The protagonist is a girl named Deuce who has just entered adulthood in her enclave at the age of 15 and has become a hunter. She's paired with another hunter named Fade, who is an outcast in her enclave. As they're out and about doing their job, they start noticing that the freak population in the tunnels is starting to act more intelligent. So they tell their leaders, but nobody wants to hear their negativity, and Deuce and Fade are exiled from their enclave and forced to go above ground. The first book, Enclave, mostly deals with that. The second book, Outpost, follows them after they leave New York City and arrive at a new town that seems to be somewhere in Maine, and it's called Salvation. Salvation is a utopia of sorts, and the citizens there seem to have never known hardship like Deuce and Fade did back home in their enclave. Deuce doesn't really fit in Salvation, and she struggles with the fact that while she was considered an adult back in the tunnels, she's still considered a child in this new town. There is more looming danger as the freak population shows greater signs of planning and intelligence, and so on and so on. While I don't think that these books did anything to reinvent the wheel when it comes to this genre, they do have entertainment value. I actually found Outpost to be the better of the 2. I thought the author made an interesting choice by juxtaposing the societal norms of the tunnel enclaves, where Deuce derives a certain amount of freedom and satisfaction from the fact that she is an adult and a contributing member of her community, with the societal norms of Salvation, where she has no say or freedom because she's still considered a child. Essentially, she's exploring what it's like for Deuce to lose her self-determination once she's already had quite a bit of it. I thought that it was a thought-provoking part of the story. However, I did have 2 main issues with the books. First, there is a love triangle. Deuce and Fade have a thing going on, but along the way they meet 2 more characters to round out their crew. One of these characters is a gang leader who has done some seriously questionable stuff, and he is put forth as a second possible love interest for Deuce. This character was wholly unsuitable as a love interest, and I think it was kind of dumb that the author even tried to sell him as one. The reasoning given is that he and Deuce are so alike that they're both survivors, and I'm just not buying that. This is a post-apocalyptic world. Literally everyone still living in it is a survivor. That's a staple of the genre and not a valid reason for a dystopian heroine to fall for a seriously unhinged and problematic dude. It doesn't bother me that the guy has moral issues because obviously anybody living in this world has had to do some sketchy shit in order to survive. But I was low-key annoyed that I was expected to buy him as a love interest when it's pretty obvious that things are not going to go that way. The second issue I had with this book was just the writing style. It's kind of more of a telling telling than a showing type of writing. And because of that, there were several moments that I feel like could have carried a lot more emotional weight, but they fell short of their full potential. I do intend to read the next book in the series simply because I already own all of them because I purchased them at a used bookstore. I rated Enclave 2 stars and I rated Outpost 3 stars. The next book I read in February was Love Wins, a book about heaven, hell, and the fate of every person who ever lived by Rob Bell. In this book, Bell explores the doctrine of hell and the afterlife in respect to Christianity. At the time that it was published, he was a pastor of a prominent American church. He was also a popular speaker in the church world, and he had even published a series of Christian education videos called Pneuma that I remember watching in my youth and college groups as a young person. When this book was released, Christians were pissed. They called Bell every name in the book, from universalist to heretic. I was told not to read it. My personal circle was abuzz with how Bell had gone off the deep end into a swimming pool full of heresy. I was in college at the time, and I really didn't have the desire or energy to read this book when it came out. But the journey that I'm on with regards to my faith kind of brought me back around to it. And so I recently ordered a copy and read it this month. I'd like to start off my review with a quote from this book. Bell says, "But in reading all of the passages in which Jesus uses the word hell, what is so striking is that people believing the right and wrong things isn't his point. He's often not talking about beliefs as we think of them. He's talking about anger and lust and indifference. He's talking about the state of his listeners' hearts, about how they conduct themselves, how they interact with their neighbors, about the kind of effect they have on the world." I'm not going to make definitive statements about the soundness of Bell's theology or whether or not he's actually heretical, because honestly, there were plenty of people doing that in the reviews already. What I will say is that what I see happening in this book is not a man drawing conclusions, but a man asking questions. He's asking, what if, and more importantly, why does any of this matter? Sometimes the doctrines we believe do matter, and we should examine the reasons why it does. But sometimes it doesn't. As Christians, I think we're far too quick to cry heresy. We are waiting for someone to say the wrong thing, to say something that doesn't align perfectly with our chosen doctrine, and then we just crucify them for it, even if the wrong thing is simply a question. I think that's what we did to Rob Bell. Christianity is over 2,000 years old, and the first church leaders that we hold in such high regard literally wrestled with these questions for years, and they still didn't reach a consensus on most of this stuff. What is perfectly acceptable in my tradition would be unthinkable in yours, and yet we are all descendants of that first century church. That should give us pause before we start defaming people for being heretics. The point I believe Bell is trying to make in this book is that regardless of which doctrine you cling to, the point of following Christ is not escaping hell and getting to heaven, but to bring God's kingdom here on earth. So if the doctrine you're clinging to isn't making you and the world around you better, if it's not seeking for justice to be done and peace to be restored, if it doesn't seek to protect all of the vulnerable among us and not just the vulnerable that we personally care about, if it doesn't endeavor to create a world where no one has to live in fear, then what is the point of clinging to it? What is the point of getting to heaven when your actions turn the world around you into hell? So many Christians are so busy looking down their noses at each other and screaming about each other's bad theology. Meanwhile, refugees suffer at our borders, poverty is rampant, and ethnic minorities are assaulted and killed in our streets. The idea that God is more pleased by the soundness of our doctrine than he is by the outpouring of our hearts for what's broken in our world is arrogant, ludicrous, and honestly, I'm just sick to death of it. So I had some strong feelings about this book. The writing style was a little informal and poetic, and Bell dearly loves his conjunctions and run-on sentences, but I still thoroughly enjoyed it. Honestly, if I'd read this book 10 years ago, I don't think that I would have been as receptive to it. But in my present journey, it was something I really needed. I've already recommended it to several friends and family members, and I rated it 4.5 stars. Moving on, the next book I read was In the Forests of the Night by Kersten Hamilton. This continued the story of Tegan Wilston from Tiger, which I read in January. I'm not going to say much about this one right now. I think I'd rather talk about it once I finish the series as a whole. The mythology is still one of the high points of this story. This one maybe did suffer a little bit from second book syndrome. There wasn't as much going on in the macro plot. The characters are kind of just waiting for the bad guy to make his move for most of the book. It also does feel underwritten in some ways. The dialogue is fantastic, but I think there are definitely moments and scenes that could benefit from more detailed description. Even so, it was an enjoyable book, and I'm eager to move on to the last one in the trilogy, and I rated it 3.5 stars. Okay, on to The North Wind by Alexandria Warwick. Here's what you need to know about it. It's set in a fantasy world known as the Grey that has fallen into a state of perpetual winter. This is where our protagonist, Wren, lives. The Grey is separated from a beyond or a land of the dead, which is aptly named the Deadlands. It is ruled by a god known as the North Wind or the Frost King. The Grey and the Deadlands are separated by a barrier that is known as the Shade, and the Shade is getting weaker. So in order to rectify this, the Frost King has to marry a human woman every so often in order to strengthen this barrier. Then ends up being that lucky gal. This is billed as an enemies to lovers fantasy romance, and it borrows heavily from Greek mythology to build the world. If you are looking for a book that is mostly romance, I think this would be an enjoyable read. I've seen several reviews that likened it to ACOTAR and Some Such by Sarah J. Maas, and that makes sense to me. This is definitely not the first or the best of its kind, but if you're just dying for more of that type of story, I think this will probably scratch that itch for you. If you start to analyze this story in any kind of depth, though, things get a bit hinky. The macro plot conflict of this story was very confusing. The Frost King is supposed to be fighting this war, but it was really unclear if he was fighting dead people or living people who were trying to break into death. A solid antagonist was missing for much of the story. And finally, I read One to Watch by Kate London Stayman. I had heard some booktubers talk about this one, and I was intrigued by the premise, but the thing that really sold me on it was that on the Amazon page, it listed a review by Hillary Clinton. She's a succinct woman. And that is literally what sold me on it. I don't know what type of book I pictured Hillary Clinton reading in her free time, but this wasn't exactly it. It turns out that the author of this book was the lead digital writer for Hillary Clinton's campaign during the 2016 election, so I'm assuming that is how Hillary came to read it. The main character is a plus-size fashion blogger named B. Schumacher. She has a pretty large social media following, and one night, while she is tweeting criticism about the lack of body diversity on a popular Bachelor-style reality show, she ends up going viral. As a result, she gets asked to star in the next season of the show and will be the first plus-size bachelorette ever to be on the show. She says yes, even though she has major doubts, and the story unfolds from there. I liked this book. It wasn't perfect and frustrating at times, but that didn't dampen my enjoyment of it. If you watched any of my recent wrap-ups, you know that I have been reading a lot of stories lately that feature plus-size protagonists, and I gotta say, I think this is the best one I've read. Many of the other ones I've read can sometimes seem more like self-insert fan fiction. The protagonists are too perfect, too well adjusted, and they don't really make mistakes. B wasn't like that. She's messy, and even though her professional life is going particularly well, she has a lot of hang-ups she needs to work through in her personal life. I really appreciate that the book didn't try to make her this unshakable bastion of body positivity and female empowerment. She got to be human, which was refreshing. I also like the way this book was put together. The story is partially told through scripts and blog posts, interviews and text messages, and I think that made the story more immersive. One of the only things I didn't really love about the story was the way the author tried to keep things up in the air with regard to B's final love interest and who that was going to be. This story revolved around a bachelorette style show, so it doesn't just give us a love triangle, it gave us more of a sudden death love pentagon. At a certain point, it became pretty obvious who she was going to end up with, and I didn't appreciate the author trying to psych me out for the remainder of the book. Because of that, B's character was forced by the plot to make some really dumb decisions, and they were dumb decisions that I don't think her character would have made if the author wasn't trying to keep us guessing which guy she was going to end up with. But I still really liked the book, and I rated it 4 stars. That's all I got for you today. If you're watching this video, it means that I have solved my editing woes, at least to some extent, so huzzah for that. If my brand of awkward appeals to you, please feel free to like this video, subscribe to my channel, or follow me on social media, which I've listed below. And until next time, tell me about a book that you've read lately that really fed your soul or brought you peace. I would love to hear about it down below. Bye.